Consider a stranger who agitates you the moment they step into a room. You have never spoken to them, yet their posture, the cadence of their voice, or the slight air of superiority they project fills you with an immediate, irrational coldness. We commonly explain this away as a simple personality clash, a harmless chemical incompatibility between two separate human beings. But consider a far more unsettling alternative. What if that person is not an independent entity at all? Imagine, instead, that the external world operates as a perfectly rendered psychological mirror, and every individual you encounter is a localized projection of your own split-off consciousness. What if the traits that infuriate you in others are not their flaws, but the exact aspects of your own mind you have buried, disowned, and locked away in the dark? When you react with intense emotion to a stranger, you are not looking at them. You are experiencing a direct encounter with your own exiled shadow wearing another person's face. We move through our social lives with a baseline conviction that we are isolated observers navigating a world populated by independent actors. We believe our relationships are linear transactions, that we look across a room, assess a person's behavior, and form an objective judgment. This perceived separation forms the bedrock of our personal identity, allowing us to feel securely insulated within our own skin. Yet, if we look beneath the surface of classical cognitive psychology and peer into the mechanics of deep neuroanalysis and advanced metaphysics, this boundary between the self and the other completely breaks down. The social environment you inhabit is not a neutral space. It is an active, continuous broadcast of your own internal landscape. The people who enter your life are not arriving by accident. They are drawn into your orbit by the powerful, unconscious gravity of your own psychological state, acting as physical actors hired by your subconscious to play out the hidden conflicts you refuse to face. When we begin to treat our social circle not as a random collection of individuals, but as an elegant matrix of self-reflection, the entire nature of human interaction must be radically redefined. We are accustomed to thinking of projection as a minor psychological defense mechanism, a brief glitch, where we occasionally mistake our feelings for someone else's. But what if projection is not an error at all? What if it is the foundational mechanism through which the human mind constructs the illusion of external reality? If your subconscious mind contains vast, uncharted territories that your waking ego cannot access, it must find a way to make that data visible. Like a projector casting an invisible film roll onto a blank screen, your mind uses the blank canvas of other people to render your hidden desires, your suppressed guilts, and your unhealed traumas into physical form. This realization forces us into an intense, uncomfortable conflict with our day-to-day interactions. If everyone you meet is a mirror, then the concept of blame becomes completely obsolete. Think of the toxic colleague whose arrogance drives you mad, the partner whose emotional distance breaks your heart, or the friend whose constant need for validation drains your energy. We spend immense amounts of mental bandwidth trying to fix, change, or escape these external actors, operating under the illusion that if we could just alter their behavior, we would finally find peace. But in the architecture of the subconscious mirror, trying to change the person in front of you is as futile as standing before a physical glass and trying to erase a smudge on your face by polishing the mirror. The external behavior is merely the reflection. The source of the stain lies entirely within the observer. To comprehend the sheer scale of this reality shift, we must examine the hidden economy of human emotion. The mind does not waste intense emotional energy on things that are irrelevant to its own survival. When you perceive someone who is lazy, greedy, or aggressive, and you feel a mild, detached observation, that trait belongs to them. But the moment their behavior triggers an acute, visceral reaction, a knot in your stomach, a flare of anger, or an obsessive need to criticize, the dynamic shifts entirely. That intense emotional spike is a behavioral alarm system, indicating that the mirror has made impact. Your subconscious has recognized a part of itself that you have forbidden your ego from expressing, and it reacts with terror because the illusion of your carefully constructed self-image is being threatened by the person standing across the room. This brings us to a profound reevaluation of what we call human compatibility and love. We like to believe we fall in love because we have found an independent soul who perfectly complements our own. But the architecture of the mirror suggests a far more intoxicating reality. We fall in love with people who reflect the golden, unexpressed potentials of our own subconscious mind. When you are mesmerized by someone's brilliance, charisma, or artistic freedom, you are not witnessing their monopoly on those gifts. You are catching a glimpse of your own dormant majesty, projected onto them because you lack the courage to claim it for yourself. The infatuation is not a connection to another. It is the deep, aching longing of the soul to integrate the beauty it has exiled from its own house. But if our entire social reality is an intricate web of self-reflection, and every friend, enemy, and stranger is merely a fragment of our own mind masquerading as an outside world, we are left with a staggering, unresolved paradox. If the people around us are just mirrors reflecting our internal state, then who is the entity truly standing in front of the glass? If the external world is a total projection of our own subconscious architecture, how do we ever break free from our own illusions to connect with anything truly outside of ourselves? To resolve this paradox, we must look beyond the boundaries of standard behavioral science and enter the profound psychological architecture mapped out by Carl Jung. Jung pioneered the understanding that the human psyche is not a single, unified block of consciousness, but an intricate galaxy composed of fragmented subpersonalities. At the center sits the ego, the tiny illuminated island of who we think we are. But surrounding this island lies the vast, uncharted ocean of the subconscious mind, within which resides the shadow. The shadow is the psychological landfill, where we discard every impulse, every vulnerability, and every desire that our parents, our culture, and our self-image deemed unacceptable. If you were taught as a child that anger is dangerous, you disowned your anger. If you were shamed for being weak, You buried your vulnerability. But a hidden law of the mind dictates that whatever is buried alive never truly dies. It merely waits in the dark, gathering psychological energy, searching for an exit. Because the ego cannot look directly into its own darkness without shattering its fragile self-image, the psyche employs a brilliant, defensive strategy. It projects the hidden data outward. The subconscious mind uses the physical world as a cinematic screen. It takes the disowned quality, whether it is a capacity for ruthless aggression or an unfulfilled creative genius, and superimposes it onto the people around us. When you interact with a partner who perpetually lets you down, or a boss who micromanages your every move, you are not merely participating in an office drama or a relationship dispute. You are witnessing a highly coordinated theatrical production staged by your own mind, designed to bring your unconscious material into clear physical focus. This cross-temporal projection introduces a startling biological parallel within modern cognitive neuroscience, the discovery of mirror neurons. In the early 1990s, neurophysicists discovered that specific clusters of cells in the human brain fire not only when an individual performs an action, but also when they observe someone else performing that exact same action. Your nervous system is hardwired to mentally replicate the internal state of the person in front of you. When you see someone expressionless but tense, your brain maps their underlying aggression within your own biology. If you possess an unexamined pocket of repressed anger within your own shadow, the mirror neuron network acts as a literal amplifier. It resonates with the external signal, triggering a massive, unproportional emotional reaction. The external actor didn't create the fire inside you. They simply threw a match into a basement that was already filled with gasoline. This realization triggers an intense psychological conflict within our daily relationships. It forces us to confront the fact that our complaints about other people are actually veiled confessions about ourselves. When you obsessively criticize someone for being self-centered, the mirror is asking a brutal question. In what way are you suppressing your own healthy boundaries? Or where are you secretly acting selfishly without admitting it to yourself? When you are deeply hurt by someone's betrayal, the mirror demands that you look at where you are currently betraying your own values, your own needs, or your own truth. The external conflict is a diversion tactic created by the ego. As long as you can stay angry at the person across from you, as long as you can frame them as the villain of the story, you never have to look down at the dark, uncomfortable truths buried in your own cellar. This conceptual shift transforms our social environment from a battleground into an interactive learning laboratory. The people who provoke your deepest agitations are no longer your enemies. They are your most precise spiritual instructors. They are the unwitting volunteers who have agreed to hold up a mirror to the exact parts of your soul you are blind to. If a person enters your life who is completely free of your specific shadow material, they don't trigger you. They pass through your field of awareness like water through a sieve. But the ones who stick, the ones who cause your thoughts to loop and your blood to boil are the keys to your lock. They are the boundary markers showing you exactly where your conscious identity ends and your repressed shadow begins. Yet, as we begin to decipher the language of the mirror and accept responsibility for the shadows we project onto our friends and enemies, an even more unsettling layer of the architecture reveals itself. If the individuals around us are actively reflecting our hidden psychological landscape, what happens when an entire society begins to project its collective shadow at the exact same time? What is the invisible mechanism that coordinates these personal mirrors into a massive societal hall of glass? And how do we learn to read the hidden patterns before the collective reflection becomes too dangerous to face? To understand how these individual mirrors coalesce into a collective reality, we must look to the ancient mythologies that served as humanity's first maps of the subconscious. For thousands of years, esoteric traditions held that the external universe is not a cold, unfeeling void, but a macrocosmic reflection of the human soul. The ancient Hermetic maxim, as above, so below, as within, so without, was not a poetic metaphor. It was an explicit structural law. In ancient Greek mythology, this law is perfectly captured in the tragic figure of Narcissus. We commonly remember Narcissus as a cautionary tale about surface vanity, a man who fell in love with his own face in a pool of water. But the deeper, initiatory meaning of the myth rests on a single, terrifying detail. Narcissus did not recognize that the image in the water was himself. He believed he was looking at an entirely separate entity, an external object of desire, and it was this illusion of separation that ultimately destroyed him. This ancient cartography of the mind aligns perfectly with the hidden symbolic core of Western alchemy. The alchemists spoke of the nigredo, the pitch-black stage of the great work, where a substance must be completely broken down, putrefied, and forced to sit in its own dark, chaotic essence before it can be purified into gold. Every intense interpersonal conflict you experience is a localized nigredo. The moment the external world introduces a person who embodies everything you despise, your consciousness is being forced into the dark container of the mirror. But because the ego operates under the law of survival, it desperately resists this alchemical breakdown. It refuses to see the reflection. It behaves exactly like Narcissus at the pond, shouting at the image in the water, trying to fight, alter, or conquer the reflection, entirely blind to the fact that it is waging an exhausting, losing war against its own face. When an entire culture refuses to undergo this personal alchemical process, the individual projections expand into a massive societal hall of glass. This is the origin of the collective shadow. When thousands of individuals disown the exact same traits, whether it is their capacity for greed, their fear of vulnerability, or their underlying aggression, they must find a collective screen to hold the projection. This is how the archetype of the scapegoat is born. Throughout history, societies have unconsciously selected specific groups, nations, or ideological rivals to act as the ultimate mirrors for their collective darkness. By projecting all evil, malice, and corruption onto the other, The collective ego feels instantly validated, pure, and righteous. The external conflict acts as a massive psychological diversion tactic. As long as a nation can focus its fury on the enemy across the border, it never has to look down at the deep systemic rot festering within its own institutions. This dynamic sheds a stunning new light on the phenomenon of modern social polarization. The hyper-reactive nature of our digital landscapes is not merely a product of bad algorithms. It is a macroscopic manifestation of the unexamined shadow. When you log onto a digital platform and witness waves of intense, obsessive moral outrage directed at a public figure or an opposing faction, you are watching the mirror neuron network operating at a global scale. The digital avatar becomes the perfect blank canvas for collective projection. People are no longer interacting with real, complex human beings. They are interacting with the symbolic representations of their own disowned, dark impulses. The fury they unleash on the screen is a desperate, unconscious attempt to execute their own shadow by proxy, hoping that if they can destroy the villain online, they will finally destroy the capacity for that specific evil within themselves. This brings us to a radical reinterpretation of the ancient practice of integration and the concept of spiritual awakening. For centuries, mystics and sages have maintained that true enlightenment is not about escaping the physical world, but about dissolving the illusion of separation entirely. If an initiate can sit across from their bitterest enemy, look past the surface hostility, and calmly recognize that the person's flaws are a precise, inverted mirror of their own hidden blockages, they dissolve the authority of the shadow. They don't react, which means the ego's defensive loop is broken. By refusing to blame the external actor, the observer forces the projection to collapse backward into the self. The mirror ceases to be a weapon of division and becomes a tool for absolute liberation. When you break through the illusion of separation in this manner, the entire architecture of your human relations undergoes a spectacular mutation. The terrifying, exhausting projections of your social circle instantly lose their heavy, threatening forms, dissolving into invitations for self-discovery. The observer realizes that the person who was draining their energy, judging their path, or provoking their anger was never an external adversary, but a mirror image of their own unexamined psyche, taking shape in the malleable clay of daily life. You discover that you have been playing both parts all along, the judge and the accused, the victim and the persecutor. The boundary wall between the self and the other disappears because there is no longer a localized identity that needs to be protected from its own reflection. Yet, as we learn to see through the masks of our interpersonal conflicts and recognize the alchemical laws that govern our social architecture, we are brought face to face with the practical landscape of our everyday lives. If the world around us is a precision-engineered training simulator designed to reveal our hidden psychological anatomy through other people, how do we translate this shattering of the mirror into a practical tool for absolute freedom tomorrow morning? How do we use the friction of our most difficult relationships to unlock our highest unexpressed human potential. To transform this shattering of the mirror into a practical tool for absolute freedom tomorrow morning, we must execute a radical shift in how we process our daily interactions. This shift requires the implementation of a cognitive discipline we can call mirror inversion. Most people spend their waking hours in a state of constant, reactive defense. When a spouse offers a sharp critique or a stranger cuts us off in traffic, our biology immediately shifts into a high beta state of survival, launching a counterattack or spiraling into internal resentment. Mirror inversion demands that the moment an emotional trigger spikes, you entirely freeze your external reaction. Instead of attempting to correct, argue with, or escape the person in front of you, you must redirect your gaze inward. You look directly at the burning sensation in your chest and ask the definitive integration question: what unowned piece of my own history is this person currently forcing me to look at? This practice completely redefines the anatomy of our daily friction. Consider the common corporate or domestic complaint of being chronically underappreciated or ignored. When you find yourself surrounded by individuals who consistently dismiss your voice, the ego immediately concludes that you are the innocent victim of a selfish environment. But if you apply the law of the architectural mirror, a far more challenging truth emerges. The external neglect you're experiencing is a physical rendering of your own self-abandonment. The people around you are merely matching the exact value you have unconsciously assigned to yourself. They are treating your boundaries with the same disregard that you treat them in secret. By shifting your perspective from the slighted victim to the primary architect of the dynamic, you stop wasting energy trying to force others to respect you, and you begin the deep, urgent work of respecting your own boundaries. Furthermore, this realization demands that we dismantle our cultural obsession with interpersonal codependency and people-pleasing. The classic people-pleaser believes they are acting out of pure, unselfish love, constantly bending their schedule, suppressing their needs, and accommodating the whims of others to maintain harmony. But the subconscious mirror exposes this behavior as a deeply manipulative strategy of the ego. The people-pleaser is terrified of their own internal shadow, specifically their repressed capacity for selfishness, healthy aggression, and personal power. To keep this dark material from rising to the surface, they project it onto the world, consistently drawing highly narcissistic, demanding, or entitled individuals into their intimate circles. They then spend their lives managing these external tyrants, entirely blind to the fact that they are using these broken relationships to maintain the comforting illusion of their own supreme saintliness. To break this exhausting cycle, you must learn the art of shadow re-assimilation. This means deliberately choosing to embody the exact traits you have historically judged most harshly in others, stripping them of their distorted, toxic expressions and reclaiming their core life force. If you are perpetually triggered by people who are loud, demanding, and uncompromisingly self-interested, it is not because their behavior is inherently evil. It is because your own psyche is starving for a healthy dose of that exact same assertiveness. You have lived so long in the prison of compliance that the sight of someone taking up space feels like an assault. Integrating the mirror means allowing yourself to say no without guilt, to demand excellence from those around you, and to occupy your space in the world with unshakable confidence. You do not become the villain you feared. You simply reclaim the raw material of your personal power that you mistakenly surrendered to the shadow. This practical shift permanently alters the structural landscape of your personal and professional life. You no longer enter meetings, social gatherings, or romantic partnerships looking for validation, because you recognize that the world has no validation to give you that you haven't already granted yourself. The microaggressions of daily life, the passive-aggressive comment from a colleague, the cold shoulder from a family member, the systemic unfairness of a rigid institution, are revealed to be precise structural rehearsals for your own psychological maturity. You realize that you cannot be truly diminished or defined by the actions of the actors in the script, because their behavior is merely a fluid, passing commentary on the current state of your own internal evolution. Yet, as you master this waking integration and begin to walk through the world with the calm, detached clarity of an unshakable observer, you are brought to the final, ultimate threshold of the human experiment. If every person you meet is a localized fragment of your own subconscious mind, and the entire social grid is a massive, interconnected hall of glass designed to reflect the soul back to itself, what is the ultimate revelation that awaits us when all the projections are completely integrated? What happens when the illusion of the other permanently dissolves? The mirror ceases to have a separate face to reflect, and we are forced to look at the raw, unvarnished reality that exists behind the glass at the end of the world. When all the projections are completely integrated, and the last stubborn illusion of the other permanently dissolves, you arrive at the ultimate revelation of the human experiment. The final, reality-shifting twist of the subconscious mirror is not that everyone you meet reflects a hidden part of you. It is that everyone you meet is you. The boundary wall between the internal observer and the external environment is exposed as a masterful piece of psychological staging. For your entire life, the firewall of the ego has convinced you that you were a fragile, isolated actor navigating a separate and often hostile world. But as you step into the absolute clarity of the fully integrated mind, the grandest cosmic joke of the simulation is laid bare. You realize that the external world was never an obstacle to be conquered, a critic to be feared, or a judge to be appeased. The entire social grid, with all its beautiful allies and terrifying villains, was a massive, multi-dimensional theater designed by your own infinite consciousness to experience the thrill of forgetting and then remembering its own nature. This understanding delivers a profound, liberating resolution to our expedition. True freedom is not found by escaping the mirror, but by consciously occupying the center of the glass. When you no longer disown your shadow or project your light, The system can no longer force you into the reactive loop of blame, victimhood, and emotional survival. The script can no longer control the author. The toxic dynamic collapses. The lingering resentment fades. The old interpersonal war ceases. But instead of darkness or isolation, you are met with an immense, unshakable peace. You do not cease to interact with the world. You simply expand into it. You wake up from the heavy, exhausting dream of being a solitary ego defending itself against a sea of separate strangers, and you return to the vast, unified reality of a conscious creator who recognizes every face on the street as a different iteration of their own soul. This realization permanently transforms the posture with which you occupy the remaining scenes of your physical life. You no longer walk through the world as a fragile survivor, desperately trying to fix or manage the behavior of the people around you. You move with the effortless grace of a master director who knows that every character in the room is a prop designed to illuminate a deeper truth. The frantic demands of the social marketplace, the manufactured panics of the digital grid, and the artificial metrics of validation lose their gravity. You can look directly into the eyes of your most difficult personal relationships, your deepest betrayals, and the broader chaos of human history with a quiet, unshakable compass. You know with absolute certainty that every friction is an invitation, every trigger is a roadmap, and the entire narrative has always been a journey back home to yourself. As you step away from this documentary and return to the immediate reality of the room around you, the dense architecture of the waking matrix will instantly attempt to reclaim your focus. The world will demand your worry. Your relationships will demand your old habits of blame, and your mind will try to pull the familiar override switches of projection. But the threshold has been crossed. The next time you sit across from someone whose words agitate your spirit or whose behavior provokes your fury, do not rush to push them away or launch into a defense. Sit perfectly still in the quiet space of your own awareness. Feel the immense weight of the mirror making impact within your biology, and look past the surface of their face. If the illusion of the stranger has kept you running for a lifetime, imagine the reality that is waiting when you finally have the courage to look into the mirror and recognize yourself.